Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of some of the major developments in the world of North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Cotham, sitting in this week for Donna King, and joining me with expert analysis are people that you read every day, every week in Carolina Journal and at carolinajournal.com. We're going to be talking to David Bass, who is a reporter for Carolina Journal and covers mainly education issues. Also talking to Tricia Cotham, who is a reporter at Carolina Journal, focusing a lot on state government, especially the executive branch. Also joined this week by Alex Baltziger, who is a Carolina Journal reporter focusing on the General Assembly. He's our legislative reporter. And David Larson, who is Carolina Journal's opinion editor. So if you enjoy all of those columns that you see at carolinajournal.com and in the Carolina Journal print edition, you can thank David Larson for that. Well, it has been a busy week, even though the General Assembly has been out of town, and now it's time for us to get to some of these big stories that we're focusing on. And so we start with our legislative reporter, Alex Baltziger. No meetings for the General Assembly this week, no floor sessions, no committee meetings. But that doesn't mean there hasn't been any legislative news. What are some of the things that we should be focusing on that the General Assembly will do once it comes back to work?
So that's a great question. So every year the General Assembly goes on a spring break, which is what we're in this week. But like you said, there was still some news coming in. So we received a press release that the House Oversight Committee was going to be bringing in staff members from Governor Cooper, who were mentioned in a previous hearing where SBI Director, State Bureau of Investigation Director Bob Schurmeyer testified. And he mentioned a couple of Cooper's staffers, and the House Oversight Committee is going to go ahead and bring them in to get their side of the story, and that'll be on Tuesday.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting, and I understand that there has been some difference of opinion about what actually happened there with Director Schurmeyer and the governor's top staffers. They tell a different story than what he talked about in his testimony before this reform committee.
That's right, and for a little bit of background on the SBI, it's supposed to be an independent agency. It's not really supposed to have oversight directly from the executive branch. It used to be under the Department of Justice up until 2014 when it was moved for administrative purposes under the Department of Public Safety, which is under the executive branch. It's still supposed to be independent, but per Bob Schurmeyer's testimony last week, it sounded like Cooper and some of his staff were starting to try to put their fingers on certain things.
Yeah, so very interesting. That'll be a hearing next week. Probably another topic for the debrief. What are some other things that we should be looking forward to from the General Assembly when they come back?
Great question. So the House has passed their budget. They revealed it. We got to see what the House wanted to do with the budget. The Senate is now going to be working on their version of the budget, and so we'll get to see where they're going to agree and disagree on certain things. Moving the SBI, the State Bureau of Investigation, out from under the Department of Public Safety under legislative oversight. That's something that the House put in their budget. So we'll see if the Senate ends up doing that. There's a couple other things in there that we'll have to watch and pay attention to see if the Senate agrees with the House. But from what I've been hearing, the Senate plans to, or they would at least like to get their budget rolled out by early to mid-May so that they have time to conference and talk about things. But potentially, we could see a agreed upon budget from the House and Senate chambers by the end of May.
And interesting to note that House budget got some bipartisan support, a number of Democrats voting with the Republicans.
That's a great point. So despite the Republicans having supermajorities now in both chambers, so they have a supermajority in the House, they have a supermajority in the Senate, meaning they can override Governor Cooper's veto potentially of anything, including a state budget. Despite that, a lot of Democrats still liked the budget. So there were 9 total Democrats in the state House that supported the budget.
Very interesting. As we're talking about the legislature, Tricia, I understand you're very interested in something that was the legislative big news last week.
You're right, Mitch. I mean, there was so much going on with this last week. The party switch for Tricia Cotham, changing from Democrat to Republican, even ran head-to-head with Trump in the national headlines. So I was just curious. It's hard to keep up. There's so much going on. I just want to know what the latest really was.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot going on. And before we get everyone else's analysis, there was actually an interesting tweet on this subject, and I think we're going to have a chance to see that coming up there. David Larson, I know you've been paying attention to this tweet. Tell us a little bit about what you thought.
Well, it's just been interesting to see the Democrat response to Tricia Cotham joining the Republican Party. So there's been a lot of theories bouncing around on Twitter, especially, and other places on how did this come to be that somebody who's been reliably Democrat for a while, her family's very involved in the Democrats, kind of jumped ship. So one theory, as you'll see in that tweet, is Carolina Forward, which is a progressive group that's fairly active online. They had the idea that she's been a Trojan horse candidate this entire time. Maybe not previous sessions that she was there, but this time after she came back after a break from not being a legislator for a while, this time Carolina Forward thought that the GOP had kind of found a way to get to her before she even ran. And their theory was they looked through the funds that she got, the donations, and saw a lot of PAC funding. And so they surmised from that a lot of these PACs, they often give to Republicans. So, the North Carolina realtors, the anesthesiologists, the dentists, pork council, there's a lot of healthcare ones in there. And Cotham had been on the healthcare committee the entire time she was a legislator for numerous other sessions. So other people would say she developed a lot of relationships there, and they thought she was probably going to win her primary. But Carolina Forward said, no, this is evidence that there was this group of PACs that got together and convinced Cotham, even before she became a legislator, you're going to run as a Democrat, get elected in this Democrat district, and then jump ship to the Republicans. Yeah. So that caused a big storm online. But even Politics NC, Thomas Mills over there, he tried to pour some water on that. He's another a longtime Democrat and progressive, and he poured water on that and said, look, I'm also a Democrat, but that's not a legitimate theory. That's not something that would have probably happened that way. These are the reason these PACs give money to Republicans is because that's who's in power right now. They want a little interest, and they give a lot to both parties. So that's kind of the theory going and some responses to it. But
before we switch off the legislative update, David Bass, you've been watching these issues for a long time. Are you surprised that this story continues to have legs?
Not surprised at all. It's interesting because just from the vantage point of this new issue of basically like ideological purity in the Democrat Party, looking at Cotham, there are a lot of people on Twitter who are really upset that she would go off of the Democrat platform basically on any issue and questioning that a lot. But I found it was interesting because they would also say, well, she's not representing Mecklenburg County, she's not representing her district and all this. But it's interesting just to look at the House budget vote and to look at there were at least maybe one or two Democrats from Mecklenburg County who still voted for the budget. So when you start looking at if you have to line up perfectly on everything in order to truly be a Democrat, then that tent gets wider and wider in terms of people you can look at who would go off and go on a vote against the governor.
I'm going to come right back to you in just a moment because we know that one of the things that's been of interest to the legislature is dealing with education issues, and you've been focusing a lot of attention, David, on education savings accounts, or ESAs. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting recent trend kind of nationally of a lot of different states creating these ESAs. And even the name ESA can be a little confusing because I think when you say it, a lot of people think, oh, it must be a 529 plan. It's something where you put your own money in there and you can save money for an education expense, something like that. What these ESAs are at the state level is actually
I'm going to jump in and mention that we're looking right now at the sponsor of a bill dealing with ESAs, Donnie Loftus. Back to you, David.
Yeah, absolutely. It's House Bill 420 that would create an ESA account here in North Carolina. Basically, the difference, though, between what you typically think of an ESA and what this is that the state we would take the per pupil allotment of state money for each student in the public school system and would give that into an account that is controlled by parents if they're choosing a non-public education option for their child. So That account could be used for private school tuition. It could be used for some homeschooling expenses. Basically, it really embodies the whole notion of the money following the child rather than just going to an institution. So if HB 420 were to pass, eventually it would phase in over a number of years, but eventually parents who wanted it could have control of this account that this year at least would be worth about $7,400, somewhere in that range. And again, it would be available to anyone, any family that wanted to leave, not just based on income or based on if the student has special needs. It would be a universal ESA. And if North Carolina did that, they would join a growing number of states that are beginning to do that, including recently Florida. Arizona did it last year, just expanding this ESA idea.
Well, it's a very interesting topic. I want to jump from one David to the other. David Larson, you are the parent of young kids. As such, what do you think about this idea of expanding these school choice options?
It's exciting to me. My children are pretty young. I have one about to turn 3 and one about to turn 1. But just even now, just hearing that, my mind gets working a little bit of all the possibilities, what I could do if I were put in the driver's seat to that extent where we have money. Our aim is to educate our children the best we can with our values and have them read and do math at a high level, as quickly as we can and all of that. But looking at some of the public schools sometimes with the scores, maybe not as high as they used to be, this would open up possibilities for how to also tailor it to specific kids' needs. Like if one kid was having certain trouble with math and you can get them a tutor, you could pay for that through an ESA. Also, it gives parents with different values. You see a lot of times the school boards in the different schools turn into sort of a cultural battleground where we're a pretty divided country on a lot of topics. And so there's always these big fights about, what's going to be taught, how it's going to be taught. You get to bypass some of that if parents are in the driver's seat and can choose, here's a school that I could send my kids to that more aligns with my values, or maybe some, you could even use it for homeschool expenses. You have homeschool co-op with 5 other families that you are in a community with, go to church with, or something like that. So yeah, as a parent of young kids, that's really exciting to me that, I was somebody that didn't really enjoy school at a young, just being a boy forced to sit behind a desk a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot of...
You're too tall for that now.
I'm too tall. I'm 6'6", and we don't belong behind little desks. But I think there's a lot of people who just, that environment is not really conducive, and so it gives a lot of potentials for different ways to learn and all that, for options for families.
Alex, you spend your time at the General Assembly, and they focus on a lot of issues, but they do spend a lot of time on things like this in education, don't they?
That's right. And back to a legislative perspective, just for the audience out there, it is looking like school choice has a lot of momentum in North Carolina right now. And it also looks like there are the votes in the legislature to get something done on the school choice issue. We had seen before Tricia Cotham switched parties that she was actually interested in promoting school choice issues and being supportive. And so I do think that the Republicans now have veto-proof overrides. So Governor Cooper, who has not always been a school choice proponent, although he did mistakenly tweet about school choice week one time. But anyways, it is going to put pressure on him now, because I believe that the Republicans will send something to his desk regarding school choice. So it is going to put pressure on him, and I'm curious what he'll do, whether or not he'll sign something.
Teresa, it's very interesting to see all this action on school choice, isn't it?
It definitely is. It definitely is. And like you mentioned about just thinking about different cases of like school bullying and things happening in public schools, I think it is wise. And I think parents, they're kind of fed up with what things are going on in the public schools. So this gives them an opportunity and a choice, especially if they couldn't have afforded it before. And they maybe even looking at a religious school, maybe they wanted to send their child to. It's a very good option. At least the option would be there for the parents.
We're going to turn our attention now away from the legislative building in Raleigh and look at Congress. And one reason is that there is a member of the North Carolina congressional delegation who's developed a bit of a national following thanks to his use of a particular type of social media. I'm talking about the freshman congressman from the Charlotte area, Jeff Jackson, who loves TikTok. But now his use of TikTok, along with one of his colleagues' use, has attracted a complaint. Teresa, you wrote about this week.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. So it was a watchdog group in Washington that saw file of complaints against Wiley Nickel and Jeff Jackson about their use of TikTok. And as you mentioned, Washington Free Beacon called, Jeff Jackson the most popular TikTok House member, 1.6 million followers.
We can see him right now. He's wearing his hoodie, sitting there, looks like he's in his kitchen, talking about issues. I think this is the one he talked about, the bank shutdown.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so, in wanting to be the most cool member out there, that's great and wonderful, but they both violated House ethics rules and went to the Office of Congressional Ethics, the complaint. Basically, they used House resources. The one for Wiley Nickel, he had his member pin on in an interview with C-SPAN, and it was in Congress, and that was a big no-no. You can't do that, can't have that. Jeff Jackson used pictures of the House floor, other pictures he used. So his complaint's a little more serious than Wiley Nickel's. And Wiley Nickel earlier this week said that he's really concerned about data storage overseas, that it is a big problem. He actually did say that in an interview with the publication. But both don't seem to be so concerned about these violations, as it seems. Like Jeff Jackson said, they're just going to see what sticks. They're going to throw something out there, see what sticks. And also said, we checked all the rules, we didn't violate anything. So they're both seem to want to continue. I think Jeff Jackson had his latest TikTok video earlier this week. So they're both kind of unfazed by it seems.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And in terms of reaction to this, Carolina Journal, you can find it at carolinajournal.com, had a story on this issue, as did one of the state's largest publications. But instead of focusing on Jackson and Nickel, it focused on conservative dark money groups attacking these congressmen. David Bass, you have been watching the media scene for a number of years. Are you surprised that the McClatchy Newspapers would take the angle they did?
Well, obviously not at all. I mean, that's the headline that they want to emphasize. I think the real test would be if it had been, say, our new Senator Ted Budd had been doing this. Would the N&O headline have been what it was? Clearly not. So it's interesting how they always want to pivot to a narrative of that nature to kind of like distract from the real issue that's going on. But it's predictable that it would happen.
Jump from one David to the other again. David Larson, I know that you're interested in TikTok and its uses and misuses. When you saw this story, what did you think?
I just think it's interesting that it's such a popular social media platform, but then it's sort of, people are just coming to realize, the Chinese are getting this data and they have access to it, at least, the Chinese government. And so there's just a lot of concern that, if congressmen are using it, or, in North Carolina, we banned its use on government computers and devices. So it's just very interesting to me that such a large and popular thing can just be found out to be sort of a source of Chinese influence and data, mining. And also, I find it interesting just from a social aspect for younger people. If you look at how China regulates social media, they have a 40-minute limit they have teenage mode. In the whole country, all teenagers can only use it for 40 minutes, where in the United States, they said the average, or most teenagers use social media for more than 5 hours a day.
Wow.
So we have and the versions of TikTok are different too. So if you look at the version in China has only very specific things they're allowed to talk about. It's less hectic, less, the topics are curated to promote healthy living and things where they seem to allow very chaotic and things that would not be positive influences on American teens. So you also wonder if the Chinese there's another motivation there to, maybe it damages American youth in a way that they wouldn't want for their own people. But
I'm just curious about whether they want everyone to learn how to do some dance and do lip syncing to popular songs.
Piggybacking off of David, there was a story out recently as Thursday that had about Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor of Arkansas. She wants to have a bill that would limit, you have to turn 18 in order to create a social media account. But I also heard in their legislature, they have some amendments to that. Like, okay, it's okay if they do a video, it's okay if they do this, do that. So see how far that goes. But that seems to be a first bill in the country like that at this point.
Very interesting. David Larson mentioned earlier that there was a state government ban on using TikTok on state government computers. That was done by Governor Cooper through executive order, but there's also legislation on that front. Alex, where do things stand with the bills moving through the General Assembly that would address this issue of TikTok?
Yeah, so that's another thing. There seems to be fairly widespread bipartisan support on this issue. I know Governor Cooper had an order, and then I remember Representative John Hardister from Guilford County signed on to something and brought something forward along with some of his Democrat colleagues on this particular issue. So it seems like there's bipartisan support on it. I'm not sure what will happen.
Well, it's a very interesting topic, and from interesting, we're now going to jump to outrageous. If you look at CarolinaJournal.com each week, you will see every Friday a column from David Larson that emphasizes the outrageous story of the week. David, people will have to wait till Friday morning to see that column, but you're going to give us a little bit of a sneak peek about it. What did you see that outraged you this time around?
Yes, that's one of the more fun parts of my job, getting to choose the outrageous thing of the week. But this week, I've been noticing a trend, just seeing a pattern where some protest and things of that nature, speech from more conservative actors is being seen as maybe violence or wanting to be moderated by those on the left, where things that are violence, maybe protests that get out of hand, they want to say, no, that's speech, protect it. So a couple examples of that kind of dichotomy there from this week. I saw the ACLU is going to be suing over a rioting bill that was a bipartisan bill. And they think that increasing penalties on rioting and just the bill in general maybe is targeting protests in a way that or targeting rioting in a way that will scoop up some people who are doing legitimate protest and having speech.
And we saw an image just a few moments ago of the boarded up YMCA after one of these violent protests that I think followed the George Floyd killing. So that's fitting in with what prompted the General Assembly to want this bill.
Absolutely. There was a lot of momentum for that. Just a lot of towns had to spend a lot of money cleaning that up. A lot of people were scared by those riots, or thought that their communities were negatively impacted by them, businesses. And but on the flip side of that, in Raleigh they have just passed an ordinance that would make harassment into a misdemeanor crime. I guess municipalities actually can pass laws that create crimes, and so that harassment bill, when they were discussing it, they said, the reason we're looking at this is there's people in Moore Square, homeless people that are yelling and creating a bad environment that way, but also Mary Ann Baldwin, the mayor of Raleigh, said the other issue is the anti-abortion protesters. And so the one who voted against that ordinance said, I'm worried that this could impact people who are legitimately protesting. And the response to that, well, I understand that, but we've also seen a lot of people at Pride performances, saying things, et cetera. So there's not currently a law on the books at the state level that would protect what they're trying to protect, which seems like more conservative speech. The examples they used were, people at Pride performances and people at abortion clinics. So the ACLU, did not come out necessarily and say that we're worried that, legitimate speech could be impacted by, this kind of a harassment bill, and saying that the way it's worded too, that the ordinance says that a reasonable person could feel as if they're in danger. It's sort of a vague thing. And they'll call that harassment. And
yeah. Speaking of abortion, after the Dobbs decision, you highlighted some protests that were done in terms of graffiti on a church.
Exactly. So after the Dobbs decision, a lot of churches were damaged. That's actually the church I attend in Hillsborough, and that says
shot was well taken.
Yep.
To keep this safe for the family.
So but you can see what that says. And there was I Heart Abortion, and there was damage, but that happened across the country. One that the Biden administration just recommended no charges, the DOJ, on somebody who did a very similar thing. They assaulted a worker at a church, spray painted, broke statues at another Catholic church, assaulted a police officer while doing that, as well as an employee at the church. And DOJ said no charge. We don't recommend charges on that. So it seems like in some of these instances, speech, be treating it as violence, and other times violence as speech, depending on maybe the perspective of the person who is doing the action. So that's kind of the outrageous thing, that trying to draw some threads there.
Yeah.
So,
Alex, what'd you think about these outrages as David has described them?
Interesting on that note, back to the bill in the legislature to prevent rioting, I think that one is very distinct from what Raleigh is proposing, in that all it does is increase penalties for people who violate the law during a riot and cause damage and violence to property, whereas the Raleigh bill seems to be doing something that's a much broader scope. And so it is interesting that the ACLU has not commented on that yet. Yeah,
very interesting, very interesting. Teresa, as you were hearing about these outrages, what were you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. It seems like we're a country that's divided, state that's divided, and both sides. The one thing's good for one, but not the other, and it's just terrible. And it seems like it's escalating on a national level. So I think the anti-rioting bill is a good thing.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens with that suit, which was just filed this
Yes.
week. David Bass, final word to you on the outrageous story of the week.
I think it's just interesting when, in listening to the debate in the General Assembly over the anti-rioting bill, there was huge concern from Democrats over whether this would have a chilling effect on legitimate protests. And in fact, some were saying that some of these individuals feel like the only way they can have a voice is by taking part in these protests that sometimes become riots, that sort of thing. So then to see the flip side, and all of a sudden for them to be extremely concerned about what in most instances is just speech, is freedom of speech, not rioting, it's just freedom of speech, to be very concerned about that because it's a political viewpoint they don't agree with, but then to opine about, oh my goodness, something that turns into a riot, this is about freedom. It's just interesting to see that dichotomy there.
Well, those are certainly outrageous stories. You can read about these stories this week and outrageous stories every week at carolinajournal.com, that column written by our own David Larson. And we hope that you will consult Carolina Journal and carolinajournal.com every day for the latest news about North Carolina politics and public policy. That's all the time that we have for the debrief this week. We thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll tune in again next week. Donna King will be back in this chair, and we hope that she will see you and that we will see you for the next edition of the debrief.